Welcome to the SACNAS Native Initiatives webinar series. Today's webinar is Cultural Identity Central to Native American Persistence in STEM, a panel discussion. My name is Dr. Daryl Monto. I am from the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma, and I serve as the SACNAS Associate Director for Mission Programs and Native Initiatives. I am coming to you today from the original homelands of the Ka, Kickapoo, Osage, and Occhichi-Sakowin in Lawrence, Kansas. We are so glad you joined us. We also have today with us Angel Rebelar, who is a SACNAS team member and will be in the chat. We're serving as our moderator for today, so shout out to Angel. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homelands to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of Native American Indigenous people. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions which we all live and work, and honor the rich culture of the Indigenous people across the country. It is our pleasure to coordinate and host these informative and educational webinars. For today's presentation, our panelists will be discussing their published article that focuses on Native American student persistence in science as it relates to cultural identity. At the end of their presentation, we will follow with the Q&A session with our panelists. At this time, I would like to introduce our panelists today. Clara Sohn, who is a graduate student at the University of Texas Health in San Antonio. Dr. Naomi Lee Seneca, who is an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Vanessa Zvila, Associate Professor at the University of New Mexico, and Dr. Neshoni Chow Garcia Dene, Director of Office of Inclusive Excellence at California University in Monterey Bay. And so at this time, it is my honor to turn this over to our panelists to begin their presentation.
Thank you for having us. We're going to bounce between speakers today, and so we'll pass it back and forth for this short presentation, but you've already introduced us, but we'll provide a little bit more information about us and our position. Of course, I had a phone call as soon as I start talking. But again, these are just where we're currently at right now, and we're going to discuss this manuscript. And so Clara will be posting different links to the current manuscript if you haven't had a chance to read it in the chat, and she'll also be posting throughout the presentation other helpful information. And so with that, next slide. I see there's already in there where you're from, so go ahead and type where you're from, your name, if you have a tribal affiliation or cultural background, and what your role is. And so this is so we can get to know all of you. And so while you're doing that, we'll then introduce ourselves a little bit more. So again, I'm Dr. Naomi Lee. I am Onotowaka or Seneca. I grew up on my traditional lands of the Seneca Nation in Western New York, and I've been involved with STEM from an early childhood, and often I have been the only Indigenous person in STEM until I've been introduced to these wonderful organizations such as SACNAS that have allowed me to connect with other Indigenous people. And so it's one of my goals now is to increase the number of Indigenous students in these STEM fields. So I'll pass it now to Neshoni. Hi
everyone, I'm Neshoni Chow Garcia. I'm Dene, and I, as mentioned before, am at CSU Monterey Bay, which is on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Eslan Ohlone people. And I'm just really grateful to be here today to share our research that really works to actively increase the number of Native students in higher education and in STEM in particular. And as the circle goes, you know, Naomi and I are connected. She was on our, as a part of my dissertation research, which is on Native STEM pathways. And I'll pass it along to Vanessa.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Svila. I'm white and descended from early English and French colonizers and settlers, and more recent German and Bohemian immigrants to the US. I was raised in a highly diverse community with 80 languages and dialects spoken in my elementary school. I received my master's degree in geology, but became labeled as part of the leaky pipeline because I decided to pursue a PhD in the learning sciences. Collectively, these experiences have really fostered in me a desire to be part of designing more just futures. And I'll pass it to Clara.
Hi, my name is Clara, and I identify as Hispanic, and my family has both Spanish and Portuguese heritage. I was raised in a highly diverse area in a lower income community. I am a first-generation college student. I received my bachelor's degree in biomedical sciences at Northern Arizona University. And now currently I am a second-year PhD student who is 232 funded at UT Health San Antonio, and I'm studying Alzheimer's disease through the lens of tauopathy. And being a first-generation student, it has really been a huge part of my goal now and in the future to just continue to mentor students who are first generation and minorities in the STEM field to try to give them the support and encouragement that they need to stay within this field. And so the background and basis of this paper is simply that Native Americans are the least represented population within the science field. And so as of 2019, according to census data, it showed that of all the PhD holders within the United States, only 0.4 of them identify as Native Americans. Also in 2019, from the same census data, out of all of the college graduates in the United States, only 0.8 of them were Native American. And so furthermore, for the students of color, earlier and prior research done has indicated that science self-identity as well as self-efficacy contributes to the student's intent to become a scientist. And so basically a science identity is the degree to which a student positions themselves and feels positioned by other scientists in the STEM field. Whereas science self-efficacy is more about the confidence that the student has in relation to basic science practices such as data analysis and literature searches. And so based off of various racial, ethnic, and gender subgroups, it has been shown that a stronger focus on culture throughout the preparation is much needed for these students into becoming scientists. And so with that being said, the purpose of this study was to better understand and characterize in how and what ways cultural and psychological processes can increase Native American students' commitment to science. And to address this study purpose, we proposed 4 research questions. And the first research question is, what cultural and psychological factors explain variance in Native students' intent to pursue a career in the sciences? The second question is, what characterizes Native students' identities as scientists, and how do they situate themselves as belonging in a community? Thirdly, what cultural and psychological factors explain variance in Native students' science identity? And the last question we wanted to address is, in what ways do Native students attribute research internships and other science experiences as contributing to their sense of belonging within the science community?
So to address these research questions, we use sequential mixed methods. First, we assess Native student perceptions broadly using a survey. We then interviewed Native interns to better understand their specific perspectives and experiences. We brought these data together to inform analytic decisions and interpretations. We recruited interviewees using word of mouth and social media, and at Native American professional organizations, specifically ACES and SACMAS. The internship program coordinators administered the survey, which included items that had been previously subject to validation studies. We measured science self-efficacy with questions like, I'm confident that I can use technical science skills. We measured science identity with questions like, I have a strong sense of belonging to the community of scientists. We measured cultural identity with questions like, I believe that a career in the STEM field is compatible with my cultural values. And we measured persistence intentions with questions like, I intend to become a scientist.
And so we had 4 programs participating at 3 different universities. And the first was the NARI program, or Native American Summer Research Internship at the University of Utah that is exclusive to Native Americans. And so this had a total of 19 individuals when we conducted this study. The second was at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, located in Bethesda, Maryland. And this is a combination of Native and non-Native individuals, but we had a total of 19 participants in this study. And then the third was at the University of New Mexico, which has both the CURE and the UPN programs there. And so the UPN program is strictly for undergraduates, while the CURE can include high school and undergraduates. And so between the two programs there, we had a total of 9 participants. And so Clara has put the links to these different programs in the chat, and so you can learn about them. Unfortunately, right now, they're not recruiting students. I believe all the applications are closed, but if you're interested in the future, or if you are interested in being a mentor, I highly suggest you can reach out to the different programs and the other authors on our paper as well. And so next slide. And so in total, between the 4 programs, we had 47 different respondents, and this was to the survey that Vanessa was talking about. And a majority of those individuals were female. And so 68% identified as female. And we also had a majority, again, most of our students are undergraduates. We had a small percentage of high school students. 43% indicated that at the time of the study, again, this was pre-pandemic, but 43% said that this was their first experience. The demographics of their parents or guardians varied between the different cohorts, but we saw that 43% of the individuals were, their parent or guardian had a high school graduate degree or less, and then about equivalent was bachelor's or higher. And a majority of the individuals also lived on or near their tribal lands, with a small percentage, around 21, that's identified as urban Native Americans. So I'll pass it on now to Vanessa.
All right, and I'll start by sharing our quantitative results first. So we wanted to investigate whether typical factors that have been shown in past research, like science identity and self-efficacy, would explain variance in Native interns' intent to pursue a science career. In past research, those with higher science self-efficacy and a stronger sense of belonging in science tend to report that they're more likely to stay in science. So we used regression modeling of the survey data, and we found support for science identity, meaning Native interns who reported a stronger sense of belonging in science were likely to report that they plan to stay in science. However, we found no significant relationship between science self-efficacy and intent to stay in science. So we thought this was interesting because it suggests that our Native interns did not connect their potential success to their current and, importantly, still developing abilities. We see this as promising and suggestive of a growth mindset, but it also raised a question for us: what contributes to science identity for Native interns? So based on insights from our interviews, we were curious about the roles of both science self-efficacy and Native identity in explaining variance in interns' sense of belonging in science. We again used regression modeling, and we accounted for 44% of the variance in science identity. Overall, we found that those who expressed higher science self-efficacy also expressed a stronger science identity. We also found that those who expressed a stronger Native identity expressed a stronger science identity. This aligns to findings from our qualitative analysis, suggesting that Native identity is linked to science identity. This is significant because it suggests that cultural identity plays a supportive role in science identity, which in turn predicts intent to persist. I'll hand it over to Nijoni to discuss our qualitative results.
Following the survey and to gain further understanding, we conducted in-person interviews, and based on our analysis, identified major themes, which included Native identity, science identity, and aspects of mentoring. Regarding Native identity and belonging, all 4 interns recognized being Native as part of their identity. And regarding Native science identity and belonging, all 4 interns discussed their science identities as being motivated by their Native identities. And regarding supportive mentors, Native interns elaborated on the significant role mentors played in contributing to their sense of belonging in science, And that included discussion of good versus bad mentoring, the significance of having Indigenous mentors, and even mentoring of others. This word cloud visualizes the words, the codes, and the major themes that emerge from the interview transcript, and hopefully gives you a sense of the qualitative process. In the interviews, Native students elaborated at length on the significant role mentors played in contributing to their sense of belonging in science. And because this work isn't just about directly impacting Native mentees, but about changing dominant, moreover racist systems, we share these guidelines for mentors of Native mentees. And really, these are generally applicable for being a supportive mentor, regardless of culture and identity. And as I go through these guidelines in the chat, I invite you to share what you would like non-Native mentors to know about supporting Indigenous students. So the first is to engage mentees in active hands-on science. And one of the practical examples that we share is to build mentee lab skills quickly to ensure participation in lab activities. The second is to identify mentee potential and develop it. So that means showing interest in mentees' reasons for pursuing STEM, sharing the purpose and implications of the research so that the mentee can decide if they find it interesting, and asking mentees for their own thoughts and interpretations. The third is to develop relationship and sense of belonging with mentees. And this, is a simple example, but really showing interest and care about their development and sharing examples of your own failures and uncertainties about your career path and model how to learn from these failed attempts. The fourth is to support diversity in general and Indigenous identity in particular. And that could include encouraging mentee participation in their own cultural norms and traditions, even if it means time away from the lab. Encouraging mentees to share, if they feel comfortable doing so, the sources of their interest in STEM, as these are often intertwined with their Indigenous identity. And many Indigenous mentees wish to return and serve their communities, so be supportive of their choices. The fifth is to recognize the significance of the Indigenous mentorship and strive to provide this support for mentees. So encourage mentees to interact with other Indigenous STEM professionals, both locally and at Native-focused conferences like SACNAS, like ACES, and talk to mentees about their futures as mentors. I'm gonna take a quick look at the chat and see if we have any responses. Nothing in particular, but I did just wanna note that we have a number of students, both Native and non-Native, and we have some faculty participants, and I think even an administrator for an Indigenous, was it SACNAS? But welcome. So we're happy to have all of you and your voices in this. All right, the next slide. Our quantitative analyses show that Native American students' science commitment is best predicted by science identity, which in turn is best predicted by science identity. Oops, I got that all mixed up, which in turn is predicted by science self-efficacy and Native American identity. Thus, Native American interns who expressed a strong sense of science identity also had higher science self-efficacy and a stronger sense of their Indigenous and cultural identity. And this model aligns to findings from qualitative analyses that further support that science identity is intertwined with Native American identity. And more specifically, interns' identities as scientists were inextricably linked to their identities as members of Native communities and tribes. And when describing their identities as scientists, they commonly reference their Native identity and sense of belonging. Westernized models, such as Chambers and colleagues, as cited in 2011 in our paper, are linear and seldom integrate culture in a meaningful manner. As such, it is necessary to move beyond Westernized models to one that centers Indigenous knowledges and values by acknowledging an interconnected relational epistemology. I'm going to pass it to Clara, who will share more about moving beyond these Westernized models to our proposed Indigenous STEM internship model.
Okay, so moving past this Westernized model, we have this Indigenous STEM internship model. And this internship model, holds Indigenous knowledges and values at the core and center. And what this is basically doing is forming this sort of positive feedback loop. And so at the core, we have these knowledges and values. And on the outside of it, we have supportive components for these Native American students. And these supportive components are their research experience, inclusive mentoring, as well as their involvement within the science community and their Indigenous support from their home communities. And so with the support components, they will then start to have an increase or enhancement of these psychological processes. And these psychological processes are their science self-efficacy, as well as a stronger sense of Indigenous identity and science identity. And so with these support components and psychological processes, in turn, this should result into the Native American students wanting to create this sort of commitment to a science career, because now they understand they no longer have to pick between their Indigenous or their science identity, and they can have both, and they can grow and foster a lot from both of them. And so once they commit to the science career, they then feed back into this positive loop by then being the mentors that these young Native American students need to see throughout their early career. And so I just wanted to ask the group in total, if you just want to put in the chat how you think that you can utilize this model, whether it be in your research lab or just in your classroom. And we'll give you guys a couple of minutes if you want to jot something quickly down in the chat. Okay, so then going on to the next slide. So in conclusion, our main goal and hope is that this research can help both current and future programs better support their Native American students on building the understanding that Native American persistence within the science field depends on both the science identity that needs to be interwoven within this Native American identity. And once these Native American students understand and have the support to have both of these identities, they'll begin to feel more secure in expressing both of these two identities. And this in turn will build their sense of belongingness within the science community and will increase the Native American students who want to persist within the STEM field. And their persistence in the STEM field will ultimately increase their capacity to serve and sustain their Native communities as well.
And so with that, we would like to not only acknowledge SACNAS for hosting us today and being able to present on our recent publication, but also all of the mentors or individuals involved with training and education of our Native students over the years. So specifically from the NIH, the past and present Native scholars that serve as mentors to the summer interns, along with NIH leadership that includes Dr. Walter Koroshetz, Dr. Catherine Roach, and Dr. Dottie Castile, in addition to the NINDS summer program mentors that now currently includes Dr. Angel de la Cruz Landro. From UNM, again, we want to thank our program staff and mentors, along with the teachers and counselors that support the program, in addition to Dr. Raj Shah and the Zuni Tribal Council. And then finally from NARI, or at University of Utah, all the staff and mentors and tribal advisors. Without everyone's support and the funding listed as well in the paper, we wouldn't be able to continue training and mentoring the next generation of Native STEM scholars. So with that, Nyaweh.
Great. This is a wonderful presentation. Thank you all again for taking time. And we'll just kind of go right into, I know that there was a comment and a question that we have in the Q&A. And for our audience, please, if you have questions, feel free to start dropping those questions in our Q&A feature. And so I'll read the information and then you can respond. So one was just a comment. Surprising, the summer program was 64% female when STEM is usually male dominated. Does anyone have a comment or a reaction to that?
I've been involved with all of these different programs, the NAR, the UNM, and the NIH, and now I have a program here. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of females putting themselves out and applying to these programs. And we are actively trying to recruit more males. And I think we even listed that as a limitation, is that we couldn't get any of our males to conduct an interview with. And so while it's great to see a lot of female representation in STEM, we do need to get our males involved in these different programs as well.
And I'll add a little to that. Native female identified students participate in higher education at a significantly higher rate than our Native male identified students. And so that is an area that we've addressed, like Naomi mentioned, as a limitation. And then also, I think, Naomi, for many of the more biomedical sciences, that there is a stronger female representation than male overall.
All right, I will go on to the first question. So amazing work. Thank you for sharing. Has your research led to any new research questions that you would like to pursue, or what's next?
Naomi, you want to answer that?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of goes back to another comment in the chat from our former SACNAS president, and looking at Native postdocs and students, because again, we focus primarily on summer programmings. So I think it would be interesting to expand this not only to these different academic levels, but also the high school students, since we've been trying to build up more of our high school programming as well. And so, yes, there are questions, and right now I have a high school program, and we're trying to get IRB approval so we can use the same survey with our current program that we have going here.
Even adding to that, Naomi's summer high school program, especially during COVID, was virtual. And so thinking about how that impacts Native student success and with regards to accessibility, this particular manuscript is years in the making. Spent many virtual hours with these wonderful women, and so we'll be percolating more ideas and ways to get involved, and we welcome others in this process because as you can tell, this is really a community effort that involves so many, especially Native and Indigenous folks across the country.
Okay, I just also wanted to say we've been using the same survey with our, we have a course-based undergraduate research experiences grant from NSF, and it's of course looking at all of the undergrad students who are in one of these courses, but we have initial findings that suggest that for our students who are from more privileged backgrounds, the questions about cultural identity don't explain a whole lot of variance in their intent to persist. But still, for our students who are from either a Chicano, Chicanx, Latinx, Hispanic background, or Native American, that in this context of undergraduate research, we're seeing similar trends. We've just gotten the data finally. We had some IRB battles, but it does seem like this approach has a lot of potential of really trying to see how cultural identity is intertwined with science identity.
All right, so we've got another question that came in the Q&A, then we've got a couple in the chat. So I'll start with the Q&A one first. This is looking at some of the demographics of the participants. The question is, were there any participants who identified as being a parent in the group, in your groups?
I don't recall us asking that specific question, but I do know we had some non-traditional students. And so that might be a question we could add as we start to expand this project.
And then in the chat, statement first, I found that a good way to start weaving culture into my math courses, especially statistics, is by presenting culturally relevant data. Any suggestions for topics that would speak to Native students?
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with NAU's Indigenous Native Educators Program. I forgot, Courtney, where you mentioned you were from, but we have a program here at NAU where we take all different types of topics and we do workshops with Indigenous serving educators, and it's mostly K through 12. And we include cultural knowledge, and so they build their curriculum and then they go back and implement it. And so, well, you talked about math. I know we've done math workshops, and so that's something I can connect you with here at NAU and what they've done with that.
Great. I'm going to jump back over into the chat. Follow-up question to the one prior from the Q&A. Sorry. Do you think you will incorporate pathways on how students can return home to work or involve tribal communities leaders on how to create job, housing, childcare opportunities for when our Native youth graduate with their degrees?
I can respond to that. We have a growing literature on Native student success in higher education. And my mentor, Dr. Stephanie Waterman, has a publication on homegoing. And this is a significant theme for our Indigenous students and an important part of this type of programming. We have in our manuscript, Naomi, I believe we have a table with some examples of how this might be incorporated and was incorporated in some of the programs in terms of developing those relationships. But I think that needs to be one of the focal points in how you design these programs and the way that we engage with these tribal nations in that capacity building. What are the needs of the tribal communities that these students come from, and how can we help develop those so that they can go back and give back.
We'll go on, and there's another question that came in the Q&A. As a mentor, how do you address the effects of colonialism and imperialism in STEM research, especially when a lot of STEM fields support fields like military and defense efforts?
I'm going to let Naomi answer that based on her experience.
Well, in the classroom setting, as an Indigenous researcher and as an educator, I am constantly bringing in work from my fellow Indigenous scientists so that they can see the work, and then also including some of the mistrust and trauma that we've experienced over the years, and why that is causing an issue even today when we see with COVID and the problems that we've had with the clinical trials and getting Native recruitment. Yeah, so I bring a lot as far as military and defense efforts. I don't have a specific response to that, but I am trying to bring it into the classroom. And then also my research, we have a lab that values our mission as well as a vision. And so I've worked with my students on developing that. And so it's really driven by student involvement and working towards representing Indigenous or underrepresented individuals in STEM and making sure their voices are heard.
All right, we have another question in the Q&A. What activities can I, as a non-Native mentor, facilitate to help my students share and express their culture?
Again, we listed some examples in the manuscript, but just to give you some things that we currently do right now is, so we have a lot of summer ceremonies. So we either try to incorporate those ceremonies into our summer programming as an event that maybe everybody will participate in, or we give that time off for students. So maybe they have to leave for a week, especially in the summer, to go to Sundance or other activities like that. And so being aware of that you have an Indigenous student and that there's a lot of different ceremonies that take place. Feast days are very common here in the Southwest as well, and having individuals participate. And so to support your students, I mean, just allow them to participate in these events and ask them about them and allow them to speak in their native language, because I think trying to bring those back into everyday life is something we encourage among our students. So we don't want to discourage it in the science setting.
The other thing I'd add is support their participation in professional organizations like SACNAS and ACES, because that is where they can go and meet other Indigenous mentors, get connected with research. And it's a way that you can show that you care and you're committed to that component. And then, ask some questions after, how was it? Maybe how does that differ? And how do you feel, about those professional organizations and the way that they support you culturally?
And I'll share some of the things that have really stayed with me from the interviews we did. I was so struck by how important it was and how valuable it was for the interns when, their mentors had shared examples of failure as a learning experience. And it's just really natural in the scientific process. I think too often there's a message that science is this brilliant linear process. And if you don't get it right on the first try, you must not belong. And I think to just agree with Najoni's suggestion of like supporting them to go to some of these conferences where they might find connections and networking opportunities to help them persist when there's messages coming. Maybe their lab's a bad fit, but maybe STEM is not a bad fit, right? They might really belong in science, but might not belong in this particular lab. And so I think those kinds of opportunities to recognize the complexity of science and to invite their interpretations of that, what they're seeing, is so important. It's important for everyone, but when you think of the impact that this can have, how, I don't know, how harmful some of the experiences have been for them with our systemic racism in our systems. There are a lot of things stacked against people succeeding. And so, as a white mentor, I try to be explicit about that and be honest about the privilege I've benefited from and not pretend like it's not there.
I'm curious, thank you for sharing that, Vanessa. For the rest of you, what were some things that stood out to you as you were going through the process, the interviews and reviewing the data? What were some things that just kind of, you weren't expecting, or some things that, yes, that's exactly what I was expecting to see? I'm just kind of curious to hear what your thoughts were from that.
I can go. One thing that really remains with me is how significant having an Indigenous mentor can be. That it resonates with myself and my experience through higher education, where it wasn't until I had an Indigenous mentor, and then I was so lucky to have 3, that actually encouraged me to go back to school and that I could do that. And so there are particular quotes from the interviews that spoke to that. And this is just a shout out to Naomi and her awesomeness, because we knew it was Naomi, and how important that was and continues to be for these Native students.
I think for me, when we look at Native identity being important to persistence in science, that was not surprising. It was more the fact that, okay, we quantified it, now here's some actual data that we can show for it. Because I feel like as a person, even a Native person that grew up on the reservation, I didn't quite connect how important my Native identity was until I had Native mentors, and that wasn't until undergraduate. And then getting involved with ACES and SACNIS, and that really helped to cultivate my Native identity. So it was something I already knew, but to actually see that come out in the data was not surprising, but encouraging, I guess.
Sure. Clara, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think what stuck out to me, and I think still does, because I struggle with it myself, and I'm not a Native American student, but it's just the need for a sense of belongingness, because like we were all addressing, science is not a linear field at all. It's like a roller coaster. And so I think having a sense of belongingness is just more important than I think people realize, especially if you look at, like, I'm first generation, so I can't just call my mom or someone in my family and say, like, what do I do here? Because they just wouldn't understand. And so having a mentor or a support system that knows where I'm at and knows that I will make it through, just to kind of help me, because there's moments in grad school or even in my undergrad career where if I didn't have, like, Dr. Lee was my PI, if I didn't have her, I don't know if I would be here, just because, like, I needed a strong mentor because I didn't have that growing up in STEM.
So important. I wholeheartedly agree. All right, so we have another question that came in the Q&A. We'll take a few more and then we'll wrap up after that. But this question, your work was done in communities that already have a large Native representation. What would you anticipate being the challenges if your approach was done at a predominantly white institution or have little to no Native presence?
Well, I can talk a little bit about the NIH because until I showed up and myself and the others were there was not a large Native presence at the NIH. And so it really wasn't, and I think somebody alluded to the other manuscript that that Vanessa and I wrote about building that program at the NIH. There was only a handful of students across the NIH. And so the fact that we were able to recruit that many students in such a short amount of time, I think is something to speak about. So again, I would not consider the NIH large Native representation. It just happens to be that small niche at the NIH that we're working with. But again, working at other institutions with predominantly white institutions, these programs exist because they're at institutions that have large Native representation in the surrounding areas, or they're able to recruit. And so I think, again, it would be interesting to provide this survey and do this study at these other institutions where there may be, like myself, I went to a different institution for my undergraduate research and I was the only Native there. And so how would that have changed if I was in a program such as the NARI or the UPN, et cetera? I don't know if anyone else wants to expand on that.
I can. I think that the challenges will have to do with resources and administrative support, where you're often going up against that number is too small. Why should we provide those resources for such a tiny number of students, and what impact can that have? And so I think it really takes a strong commitment by those who are willing to take that on, and some strong partnerships. And that often can be with professional organizations like SACNAS, like ACES, with the local Indigenous tribes, with connecting, like many of these do, as a consortium, because we didn't conduct the survey just at one institution. It was a number, and that was what we had to do to be able to be able to conduct this. I think that we'll continue to confront that, and it's about connecting with even any one of us on here, because we are committed to being a collaborative effort to increase Natives in science.
It does speak to the importance too of internships, and again, being active in professional organizations. But I do wonder if there are opportunities for some new designs, in light of the pandemic and our now capacity with Zoom in so many ways. If that's not a way to also form some new programs that help build connections across these spaces. So
I would say
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I would say adding on, because of the pandemic, we've all gotten so used to using Zoom and being a little bit better with technology. I think for those areas where it is predominantly white, it would be good to have maybe start off something small, like a Zoom group or something where these students can come together and actually have this safe area to kind of talk about their struggles and what they're dealing with. Because again, you do come with the struggle of, if there's only such a small portion of them, why should we give them these resources? And I don't think that's a fair mentality to have, but it is the mentality that some people have. And I think having smaller groups that meet over Zoom, or have like a group me or something virtual, it can just be that little push to get them to keep going, because they're not alone.
That's so true. I think the support that our students receive really helps them in their overall persistence, and being able to have that connection and that good relationship, with a mentor, and even the faculty that are in their respective programs is so vital too. And just kind of referencing, the interns, internships, that are at predominantly white institutions. Agreeing with you, Najoni, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the administration's behalf, especially if they're looking to increase their diversity. I know that that's always been a big thing, for institutions. We want more representation, people of color, students, to be at our institutions, but what are they doing, to bring those students to their campuses, and how are they making them feel that they're a part of the campus too? So there's a lot of work that needs to go in, that needs to be done on that part too. So, but this has been great. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate, again, all of you taking time. I know that there are a few of the authors that weren't able to be here, but for those of you in the audience viewing, I know that Clara has shared some links. Please take time to review that information. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to fully review the manuscript, I highly encourage that you take time to do that as well. And we will go ahead and I need to share my screen one more time and we will wrap up here. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can find more upcoming and previous webinar recordings on our website at sacnas.org/webinars. Finally, immediately following this webinar, you will be sent a survey that takes less than 3 minutes to complete. As members and our supportive community, your feedback is so critical to us. Please take a few moments to submit the survey and let us know what you thought about today's webinar. Your feedback helps us to improve as well as identify topics for future programs for you. And this concludes our webinar with Najoni, Naomi, Vanessa, and Clara. Thank you for taking time to join us, and we will see you next time.